He offered me $10,000 to pretend to be his girlfriend for one weekend. No strings attached, he said coldly. What my intimidating boss didn't realize was that I could read people like books, and beneath his icy exterior was a man desperately trying to hide his broken heart. Have you ever wondered what actually goes on behind the polished glass doors of those towering skyscrapers downtown? I can tell you, every single detail. Because for the past 3 years, I've been the executive assistant to Alexander Reed, CEO of Pinnacle Investments. And trust me, it's nothing like those glamorous office romances you see in movies. Let me introduce myself. I'm Maya Chen, 28, with an organizational skill set that borders on supernatural and the patience of a saint, a necessary qualification when you work for a man nicknamed the Ice King by the entire office. My days consist of managing his impossible schedule, fielding calls from clients who've been left frozen by his blunt assessments, and making sure his coffee is exactly 165 degrees. Not 164, not 166, 165 degrees. I've literally been sent back to the break room for a single degree difference. Alexander Reed isn't just cold, he's Antarctic. 6'3" of impeccably tailored suits and sharp features that never, and I mean never, soften into anything resembling a smile. His eyes are this piercing steel blue that seem to calculate your worth to the company with every glance. The interns actually take alternate routes to avoid passing his office. I've seen grown men in $5,000 suits stammer when he enters a conference room. But here's the thing about working so closely with someone for 3 years. You start to notice things. The slight tightening around his eyes when he receives certain calls. The way he stares out the window on April 22nd every year. How he keeps a small, worn book hidden in his desk drawer that he thinks nobody knows about. Little cracks in that perfect, icy façade. I thought I had him figured out. I thought I understood the careful distance he maintained from everyone. That is, until last Tuesday, when he called me into his office and made an offer that shattered everything I thought I knew about Alexander Reed. "I need a girlfriend," he said without looking up from his computer screen. "For the weekend. I'm willing to pay." And just like that, my carefully structured world tilted on its axis. If you've ever wondered what lies beneath someone's carefully constructed walls, stick around. Because what happened next wasn't just about a business arrangement that crossed professional boundaries. It wasn't even about the ridiculous amount of money he offered me to play pretend. It was about discovering that sometimes the coldest exteriors are built to protect the most vulnerable hearts. And somehow, despite all my defenses, I found myself becoming the one person who could see right through Alexander Reed's perfect facade. Hit that subscribe button, because this story might start with a fake relationship, but what it revealed was anything but fake. The morning it happened was completely ordinary. I'd arrived at 7:30 a.m. as usual, prepared Alexander's workspace with the financial reports he'd need for his 9 a.m., and placed his coffee 165 degrees, black precisely 3 inches from the right corner of his laptop. The office hummed with that peculiar energy of ambition and anxiety that defines corporate America. When his call came through on my desk phone at 11:17 a.m., I expected the usual terse request for documents or a schedule change. Instead, his voice, somehow even colder than usual, simply said, "My office. Now." The walk to his corner office always felt like approaching a dragon's lair. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Manhattan skyline, the perfect backdrop for a man who seemed to believe he commanded the city itself. He didn't look up when I entered, just continued typing with machine-like precision. "Close the door," he said, still not making eye contact. I did as instructed, my mind racing through possible scenarios. Was I being fired? Had I made some catastrophic error with his calendar? Was the coffee 164 degrees? "I need a girlfriend," he said, the words so unexpected I almost laughed. For the weekend, I'm willing to pay. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood frozen, wondering if I'd stepped into some alternate reality where Alexander Reed made jokes. Finally, he looked up, his expression as unreadable as ever. My sister is getting married this weekend in Connecticut. Family event. My mother has been persistent about my relationship status. And you want me to? I trailed off, still struggling to process. Accompany me, pretend we're in a relationship, answer questions appropriately. That's all. He slid a folder across his immaculate desk. $10,000 for 3 days. All expenses covered, of course. The folder contains the details you'll need to know about me for believability. $10,000. That was 3 months' rent. That was the student loan payment I'd been struggling with. That was insane. Why me? I managed to ask. Something flickered across his face. Annoyance? Vulnerability? It disappeared too quickly to identify. You're organized, professional. You know my schedule, my preferences. You won't become emotionally invested. He said this last part with such certainty, as if the very idea of anyone developing feelings for him was absurd. And if I say no, then I ask someone else. His tone made it clear he expected no resistance. I need an answer by end of day. I should have said no immediately. This crossed every professional boundary imaginable. But as I walked back to my desk, that folder clutched in my hands, all I could think about was my struggling bank account, my sick cat's upcoming vet bills, and, if I'm being completely honest, a burning curiosity about the man behind the Ice King persona. What would Alexander Reed be like outside these walls? What kind of family had produced someone so meticulously controlled? And why go to such lengths to maintain a lie? By 5 p.m., I'd made my decision. I knocked on his door once more. I'll do it, I said, but I have conditions of my own. For the first time ever, I saw surprise register on Alexander Reed's face. I never imagined I'd spend my Saturday afternoon shopping for clothes with Alexander Reed. Yet there I was, sitting awkwardly in an upscale boutique while he spoke in hushed tones with a sales associate who seemed to know him personally. The folder he'd given me contained a company credit card with a note. Purchase appropriate attire. No budget restrictions. No budget restrictions. 3 words that had never applied to my life before. The wedding is semi-formal, he said, appearing suddenly beside me, his presence commanding as always, despite being in casual clothes, though Alexander's version of casual still involved a tailored button-down that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The rehearsal dinner is tonight, family brunch on Sunday. You'll need outfits for all 3, plus something comfortable for travel. I nodded, trying to look like this was all perfectly normal. Do you have color preferences? Your family might find it strange if we don't complement each other. Something shifted in his expression, surprised perhaps that I'd considered such details. Navy for the wedding. I don't care about the rest. 3 hours later, I had more designer clothes than I'd owned in my entire life, all packed neatly in a suitcase that also wasn't mine. The sales associate had looked at me with thinly veiled curiosity throughout, undoubtedly wondering what someone like me was doing with someone like him. That evening, we met at an empty restaurant, closed to the public for our rehearsal. We need our story straight, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. Details matter. My family will ask questions. He'd prepared a dossier, because of course he had. How we met, a charity gala 8 months ago, our first date, dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant I'd never heard of. Why we'd kept it private, his preference for separating personal and professional life. Everything meticulously crafted, like a business proposal. You've thought of everything, I said, scanning the pages. Though I'm not sure I can memorize all this by tomorrow. Just the basics. Improvise the rest. Just make it believable. I looked up at him then, really looked at him, sitting there planning out a fake relationship with the same precision he used for corporate acquisitions. Why go through all this trouble? Couldn't you just tell your family you're focused on your career? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My mother is dying. The words hung in the air between us, stark and heavy. I'm sorry, I whispered, genuinely shocked. Nothing in the dossier mentioned this. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give her until Christmas, maybe. His voice remained completely even, but his knuckles had gone white around his water glass. This wedding is important to her. Seeing her children settled is important to her. Suddenly, the Ice King wasn't looking so icy anymore. He was looking like a son, trying to give his dying mother peace of mind. We should practice, I said softly, choosing not to press further. The physical aspects, I mean. It can't look awkward when you touch me, or it won't be believable. For a split second, I swore I saw panic flash across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual composed expression. He reached across the table, his movements precise as he took my hand in his. His touch was warm, warmer than I'd expected from someone so outwardly cold. Like this, he asked, and for the first time, I heard a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Our hands remained connected across the table, and something strange happened in that moment. As I looked at this man I'd worked for and feared for 3 years, I suddenly saw something I'd never noticed before. Alexander Reed was scared. Not of me, not of the arrangement, but of something deeper, something hidden behind those steel blue eyes. That's perfect, I said, giving his hand a small squeeze. They'll totally believe we're madly in love. He almost smiled then. Almost. The drive to Connecticut was mostly silent, save for the classical music playing softly through his car's luxurious sound system. I spent the time mentally rehearsing our relationship details and stealing glances at Alexander, who seemed more tense with each passing mile. His normally perfect posture had stiffened even further, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. We're almost there, he finally said, breaking the silence as we turned onto a tree-lined private drive. My family's estate has been in the Reed family for 4 generations. Estate, not house, not property. Estate. I tried not to gawk as the trees parted to reveal what could only be described as a mansion, a sprawling colonial structure with perfectly manicured grounds and a circular driveway where several luxury cars were already parked. You grew up here? I asked, unable to hide my awe. Until college, he replied flatly. Then, surprisingly, he added, the East Wing has a library with a hidden door behind the bookcase. I used to hide there when family gatherings became overwhelming. It was such an unexpectedly human detail that I turned to look at him, but his expression had already closed again as a group of people emerged from the front door. Remember, he said quietly, we're in love. Then he did something that nearly stopped my heart. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my cheek for just a moment. The gesture was so tender, so unlike the Alexander Reed I knew, that I momentarily forgot to breathe. Ready, Maya? He asked, using my first name for what might have been the first time ever. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of introductions. His sister Eliza, the bride, who squealed and hugged me with surprising strength for someone so petite. His father, Robert, a silver-haired version of Alexander, with the same commanding presence, but a much warmer smile. Various aunts, uncles, cousins, all regarding me with varying degrees of shock and curiosity. Alexander with a girlfriend. We thought hell would freeze over first, his cousin James joked during dinner, earning a chorus of laughter and a tight-lipped non-smile from Alexander. But it was his mother who watched us most intently. Catherine Reed was elegant even in her illness, her blue eyes, so like her son's, missing nothing as she observed our interactions from her place at the head of the table. How did my son win your heart, Maya? She asked during a lull in conversation, silencing the entire table. He's not exactly known for his romantic gestures. I felt Alexander tense beside me, but underneath the table, I gently placed my hand on his knee, a gesture meant to reassure. Actually, I began, ignoring our rehearsed story completely. It was during a charity event, not because he donated generously, though he did, but because I saw him talking to an elderly server who'd spilled water on his expensive shoes. Everyone else at the table was irritated, but Alexander helped the man clean up and then slipped him what I later learned was enough money to cover his grandson's semester of college. Complete silence fell over the table. Alexander stared at me, something unreadable in his eyes. "That never happened," he said quietly but not accusingly. I smiled at him, holding his gaze. "It did. Last year's Education Foundation gala. You didn't know I saw." The look of genuine surprise on his face was worth the risk of going off script. Even more surprising was when he reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. Later that night, as we awkwardly navigated sharing the bedroom his mother had insisted upon, "Don't be ridiculous, Alexander, we're not Victorian." I caught him watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. "You noticed that?" he asked quietly. "About the server?" I nodded, arranging pillows down the center of the bed as we'd agreed. "I notice a lot of things about you that you think nobody sees." He looked almost unsettled by this, turning away to stare out the window at the moonlit gardens below. "My mother likes you," he said finally, "more than any woman I've ever brought home." "I'm the only woman you've ever brought home, aren't I?" I guessed, and his silence confirmed it. That night, lying in the dark with just those pillows between us, I heard him whisper, "Thank you, Maya," so softly I almost thought I'd imagined it. Something was shifting between us, something neither of us had planned for. And as I drifted off to sleep, I wondered what other secrets lay behind the carefully constructed walls of Alexander Reed. The wedding itself was beautiful, all white roses and string quartets under a massive tent on the Reed family lawn. Alexander played his part perfectly, his hand resting on the small of my back as we mingled, pulling out my chair at dinner, even occasionally leaning in to whisper comments that made me laugh genuinely. If I didn't know better, I'd have believed we were a couple myself. It was during the reception, as the evening stars appeared and fairy lights twinkled overhead, that everything changed. Alexander had gone to get us drinks when I overheard his name mentioned from behind a nearby topiary. I shouldn't have listened, I know that, but something in the hushed, urgent tone made me pause. "I'm just saying it's the anniversary of the Vanessa situation. You know how he gets this time of year," a female voice, Eliza, his sister, was saying. "He seems different with this one," came his father's reply. "I haven't seen him this present since before it happened." "Do you think she knows about Vanessa? About the engagement?" My heart stopped. Engagement? There was nothing in the dossier about an engagement. Catherine thinks not, but maybe that's good. 4 years is long enough to grieve a relationship, especially one that ended so. I moved away quickly as Alexander approached with our champagne, his face impassive as ever, though something about his eyes seemed softer in the gentle lighting. The night continued, but my mind was elsewhere, pieces falling into place. April 22nd, the day he always stared out the window, the worn book in his drawer, the complete absence of personal relationships. When we finally returned to our room, the weight of unspoken questions hung heavy between us. I watched him methodically remove his cufflinks, his tie, his jacket, each movement precise and controlled, just like everything else about him. "Who's Vanessa?" I asked quietly. He froze, his back to me, shoulders suddenly rigid. The silence stretched for so long I thought he might not answer at all. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "I overheard your sister. I know I shouldn't have, but it's not relevant to our arrangement." His walls were suddenly back at full strength, voice glacial. Something in me snapped. 3 days of pretending, of glimpsing the real man behind the facade, only to have him retreat again. It was too much. Stop it, I said, surprising even myself with my firmness. Just stop it, Alexander. For 3 years I've watched you hide behind this perfect cold exterior. I've respected your boundaries, your privacy, but I'm tired of pretending I don't see it cracking. He turned to face me, eyes flashing. See what, exactly? The pain. The way you check your phone every April 22nd as if expecting a call that never comes. The way you flinch when someone mentions commitment or relationships. The small acts of kindness you try to hide. I stepped closer. I see you, Alexander. The real you, and I'm tired of pretending I don't. Something broke in his expression then, a dam bursting after years of careful maintenance. He sank onto the edge of the bed, running a hand over his face, in a gesture that suddenly made him look vulnerable, human. We were engaged, he said finally, voice barely audible. 4 years ago. The wedding was planned, everything arranged. 3 weeks before, she called it off. Said she couldn't spend her life with someone incapable of real emotion. His laugh was hollow. She was right. I sat beside him, careful to maintain a small distance. She wasn't right. Being guarded isn't the same as being emotionless. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. How do you do that? Do what? See through people. See through me. I smiled softly. It's a gift. And a curse. My mother called it being an emotional sponge. I absorb the feelings people try to hide. And what am I feeling right now, Maya? He asked, my name on his lips somehow different than it had ever been before. I held his gaze, taking a risk I'd never have dared in our normal lives. Fear, relief, and something else. Something you're not ready to name yet. His hand found mine in the space between us, fingers intertwining with mine so naturally it made my breath catch. I hired you to pretend, he said softly. I never expected you to understand. In that moment, with moonlight streaming through the windows and the distant sounds of celebration still floating up from the garden, something real began to replace what we'd been pretending, something neither of us had anticipated when we made our arrangement. Monday morning arrived with a jarring return to fluorescent lights and elevator music. The bubble of Connecticut, of whispered confessions and hand-holding, and something that had begun to feel remarkably real, burst the moment we drove back into Manhattan. Alexander dropped me at my apartment Sunday night with awkward formality, a white envelope containing my payment, and a stiff, "Thank you for your assistance." No mention of the moments we'd shared, no acknowledgement of the walls that had crumbled between us. Just a return to boss and employee, as if the weekend had been nothing but a business transaction. I told myself it was fine. Expected even. We'd played parts, nothing more. But when I walked into the office that morning, something had shifted. Alexander wasn't at his desk yet, unusual for a man who typically arrived before dawn. His calendar showed his first meeting pushed back by an hour. No explanation. When he finally appeared, he walked straight past my desk without acknowledging me. The Ice King had fully returned, his armor seemingly impenetrable once more. "Coffee," he said through the intercom, not even a please or thank you. As I prepared his usual, my hands shook slightly. How could he just switch it off like that? The man who'd held my hand under moonlight, who'd shared his deepest wound, who'd looked at me with such unguarded emotion, had he simply packed all that away with his weekend luggage? I placed the coffee on his desk, 165 degrees, black, 3 inches from his laptop corner, and turned to leave. Maya. I froze at his use of my first name. In this office, I had always been Ms. Chen. "Mr. Reed," I responded, not turning around. "The weekend," he began, then stopped. I could feel his struggle without seeing his face. "It was a business arrangement. Professional boundaries should be maintained." The words stung more than they should have. I nodded, still facing the door. "Of course. Will that be all?" No. His chair creaked as he stood. Look at me. Please. I turned. Alexander stood ramrod straight behind his desk, but his eyes, those steel blue eyes that had softened so much over our 3 days away, were conflicted. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, so quietly I almost didn't hear. Do what? Navigate. Whatever happened between us, I've kept my professional and personal lives completely separate for good reason. And what reason is that? I asked, finding courage I didn't know I had. So you never have to risk being hurt again. So you never have to be vulnerable. His jaw tightened. You don't understand the complications. I understand fear, I interrupted. I understand building walls so high no one can scale them. But I also understand that sometimes, very rarely, someone comes along who can see through those walls like they're made of glass. We stood there, the massive desk between us like a physical manifestation of all the barriers he'd constructed. The silence stretched, filled with unspoken words and possibilities. Finally, I made a decision. I placed my company ID on his desk. I quit. His face paled. Maya. I can't go back to being the invisible assistant who brings your 165-degree coffee and manages your calendar while pretending I don't see the man behind the facade. Not after this weekend. I took a deep breath. You have my number. If you decide you want something real instead of another business arrangement, use it. I walked out of his office with my heart pounding, and no safety net beneath me, no job, no plan, just the terrifying free fall of honesty. 3 days passed, then a week, nothing. I started applying for new positions, telling myself it was for the best, that whatever I thought I'd seen in Alexander had been wishful thinking. Then, exactly 10 days after I'd walked out, my doorbell rang at 9:43 p.m. Alexander Reed stood in my hallway, no suit, no tie, looking more undone than I'd ever seen him. I don't want to be your boss anymore, he said simply. I already quit, remember? I replied, heart racing. I don't want a fake relationship either. He stepped closer. I want something real, something that terrifies me, with you. And as he reached for my hand, the same way he had that first night at the restaurant, uncertain yet determined, I realized that sometimes the coldest facades really do hide the warmest hearts. You just have to be brave enough to see through them. Looking back at how it all started, it's almost laughable now. Me, agreeing to be Alexander Reed's fake girlfriend for a weekend. Him, thinking he could pay for emotional intimacy and then file it away like one of his business reports. Both of us, completely unprepared for what would happen when pretense gave way to truth. It's been 6 months since I stood in my apartment doorway, looking at the most intimidating man I'd ever known as he fumbled for words like an ordinary person. 6 months of discovering who Alexander Reed really is when the armor comes off. It turns out there's an entire world behind those steel blue eyes. A man who reads poetry late at night, who makes pancakes on Sunday mornings, who still struggles to express his feelings but tries anyway for me. Not that it's been easy. You don't spend years building walls without reason, and Alexander's don't come down without a fight. There are still days when he retreats, when the vulnerability becomes too much and the Ice King returns. But now I understand that his coldness was never absence of feeling. It was protection from too much of it. His mother passed away 2 months ago. I held his hand at the funeral as he stood stoic and silent, his grief visible only in the slight tremor of his fingers intertwined with mine. Later that night, he finally broke, sobbing in my arms until dawn. She liked you, he kept saying. She knew it was real before we did. The most surprising part of all this isn't that the Ice King had a heart. It's how many people never bothered to look for it. How many colleagues and acquaintances were content to accept the facade because it was easier than seeing the human beneath it. We all do it, I suppose. Judge people by the walls they build, rather than wondering why they needed them in the first place. Alexander still runs his company with the same precision and high standards. I found a position at a non-profit I love, where my emotional sponge abilities are considered an asset rather than an intrusion. We're building something real, day by day, truth by truth. It's messy and imperfect, and absolutely terrifying sometimes, especially for a man who spent years believing that control was the only path to safety. But here's what I've learned. The most carefully constructed facades often hide the most beautiful truths. The coldest exteriors frequently protect the warmest hearts. And sometimes, the greatest love stories don't start with love at first sight. They start with seeing someone, truly seeing them, when everyone else has stopped looking. Remember that person in your life who seems unreachable? The one with walls so high you've stopped trying to scale them? Maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for someone brave enough to see through their carefully constructed facade. Someone who won't be fooled by the performance, who'll recognize the humanity hiding underneath. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. And stay tuned for next week when I tell you how our first real date went terribly wrong, in the best possible way. Because the most authentic relationships aren't about perfection. They're about being perfectly imperfect together. Image Pramat. A confident young woman in a stylish office outfit stands next to her tall, handsome white boss in a sleek, modern corporate office. She has a knowing smirk, while he maintains a cold, professional exterior, but his eyes reveal hidden warmth and vulnerability. The atmosphere is filled with tension and unspoken emotions. Large floor-to-ceiling windows showcase a city skyline in the background, and soft, warm lighting contrasts with the cool, professional setting. Subtle details hint at a fake relationship, like their slightly forced closeness or a contract folder resting on a desk.